Lucky Land Slots, asking people, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
Lucky? In line at the deli, I guess?
Aha, in my dentist's office. More than once, actually.
Do I have to say?
Yes, you do.
In the car before my kids' PTA meeting.
Really?
Yes.
Excuse me, what's the weirdest place you've gotten lucky?
I never win and tell.
Well, there you have it. You can get lucky anywhere, playing at LuckyLandSlots.com. Play for free right now. Are you feeling lucky? No purchase necessary. Void where prohibited by law. 18 plus. Terms and conditions apply. See website for details.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be concluding our look at Aimee Semple McPherson, the early 20th century evangelist. And Chris, there's a lot to talk about when we talk about McPherson. And of course, in these two episodes, we're sort of just hitting the high marks.
Yeah, last episode, we had a great opportunity of introducing our listeners to her. And we talked a lot about her upbringing and then into her ministry and some of the ways that she tried to blend entertainment along with religion, the creation of the tabernacle. And, I think that this episode in itself just kind of directs us to how far one can fall from, the prominent seat of power when it comes to an evangelist. And we can go back and remember that, Aimee McPherson was born into a scandalous home. And I really think that influences her life as, she develops her own intimate relationships as she goes on, falling in love with the gospel. She fell in love with the one who introduced her to the gospel. And, they're falling in love, they get married, they're serving overseas as missionaries. And then, the husband dies. And all of a sudden, Aimee is like in a whirlwind of insecurity and loneliness. And then she falls in love with the desire to preach the gospel. And she falls in love with another man that she is hoping will join her in that expedition. But he's not interested. He doesn't want to travel the country. He doesn't want to share the gospel. And so what she does is she basically says, hey, I'm choosing Jesus over you. If you want to join me, that's great. But if not, sorry, that's not going to, I'm just not giving up my relationship with Jesus. And so he gets tired of her, files for divorce. And then, we come to husband number 3, and she will fall in love with this third gentleman. And this time she kind of repeats her father's past relationship with her mother. She marries a man who is 11 years younger than she is. And I think it's at this moment, and Aimee says this, that this marriage brings humiliation and despair. And it really causes her ministry to decline. And she says, quote, "It was a terrible mistake. And she had made it because she was so lonely." And Ray, I think that is kind of the beginning of the end of her ministry, because of what we're focusing on today is that her ministry is now under scrutiny. Gone are the throngs of people craving to hear a message from her, really desiring to get on board the McPherson train, if you will, with the gospel car. And now they're starting to find all of these inaccuracies because basically she's not practicing what she preaches. And Ray, that leads to Aimee disappearing, if you will, in May of 1926.
Yeah, her disappearance is going to be a very controversial issue at the time. In fact, the district attorney out in Santa Monica, California, is going to get involved in this disappearance, investigating what happened. It's going to be something that's going to be a cloud over the rest of her life and career. And it's something that when people talk about Aimee Semple McPherson, even today in the 21st century, almost 100 years later, people still are talking about this disappearance that occurred. It occurred on May 18, 1926. Aimee Semple McPherson has gone to the beach, apparently to maybe just have a day away or whatever the case may be. And she disappears. And that was sort of the last anybody saw of her for several weeks. and there is general panic. Her mother, who we talked about a little bit on the last episode, her mother shows up at Angelus Church, or Angelus Temple, the following day, announcing that she had disappeared. There is obviously searches going on for her. People searching the beach. People, looking, where has she gone? What has happened to Aimee Semple McPherson? Of course, the sort of big theory at the time was that maybe she had gone swimming and drowned. But Chris, the reality of what happened is going to be far more complicated than someone who just went into the ocean and got hit by an undertow.
Yeah, but I go back to what you were saying. This is in 1926. There's not breaking news. There's not social media or things like that. But the country is captivated by her reported death, and there is a massive search that is undertaken. I mean, people start going to the beach. They start looking for her, and actually, two of the searchers die in the process of looking for Aimee McPherson. So, this is not just hey, Aimee's gone missing, we wish the best. This is Aimee's gone missing. Let us all trying to go and try to find her. And while they're searching, we start to see what usually happens, where all of these theories and these assumptions, and I guess the other way would be rumors, start to circulate. And then two of them really interested me. There was that one rumor that somebody said that there was a male preacher, a local male preacher, who was jealous, if you will, of Aimee preaching and having success and being popular, and so had her murdered. And then I think there was another theory that suggested that a mob leader was upset with Aimee because she had opposed some kind of dance hall, and so the mob leader had her killed. But Ray, regardless of the different theories, people were genuinely concerned about what was going on, and they wanted answers. And while those two theories were bad, there's others that are going to start to develop, which makes it even worse.
Yeah, and after several weeks of speculation and searching and mourning, Aimee's mom decides, okay, enough time has gone. I think we could sort of metaphorically and literally lay this to rest. And on June 20, 1926, Minnie Kennedy holds a very elaborate memorial service for Aimee Semple McPherson there at Angelus Temple. And of course, just like with everything else in this woman's life, it was packed and it was a bit of a show.
Yeah. And so I guess, this is where it gets interesting, because the one theory that we haven't really talked about with this is that some people said, okay, and history does show this, Aimee's lost her luster a little bit because of some of the events in her own life, that she's become more entertaining rather than religious. And those who have converted to the faith don't appreciate that. They don't like that. And so because, she is stressed out, because she goes to the beach, maybe some people think that she's using this as a publicity stunt. Brings attention to her ministry, right? She's one that used to fill thousands and thousands of seats. She's not doing that anymore. People are not as engaged in her as they used to be. And so, disappearing for a while and not really being able to find her could cause people to say, oh no, let's, and it worked. And so maybe that was one theory. But the other one that was interesting to me is that she had run off with her radio director, who just happened to be married.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because Minnie Kennedy holds this memorial service at Angelus Temple on June 20. Aimee Semple McPherson reappears 3 days later in a town just south of Douglas, Arizona. She shows back up, Chris, and she's got a story, okay? And this story is that she had been kidnapped after being lured into a car, 3 Americans, one of whom was a guy named Steve, another one was a woman named Rose, and they had taken her to this shack in Mexico and apparently had kept her, locked away and drugged up for several weeks. She finally, is able to sort of, I guess, break the ropes or whatever and gets out. And she walks some 20 miles through the sand, where she's found. She collapses. She's taken to the hospital, and she actually is put in contact with her mother. So she gets back in contact with her mother, and of course, everybody's celebrating. And she comes back to the church a short time later, and there's this huge parade, a massive parade that even filled up more than 50,000 people. And they had airplanes dropping flowers from the sky. There's this big parade, and everybody's so happy. Aimee Semple McPherson is back. Sister is back, as they called her. And everybody's excited, except there's some questions, like you said. There's this guy, his name is Kenneth Armiston. He's a married man, and he worked at KFSG, which was the radio station that was owned by McPherson and I think it was stationed out of her church. We talked about it on the first episode. And interestingly enough, Chris, going back to the theory you mentioned, he disappeared around the same time she did. And there were rumors that he was spotted in Northern California with a woman who looked suspiciously like Aimee Semple McPherson.
And the one group of people who is not, I guess, just relieved and so happy and letting it go is the actual police, because this is a serious situation. Because what has now happened is that Aimee has explained that she was kidnapped. So therefore, and you mentioned Americans, and so that is a crime. And that causes the police to have to investigate. And in addition, she said that the reason that she was kidnapped was in exchange for a ransom from the church, which therefore then comes into extortion and bribery. So while there is this huge celebration that is ongoing, McPherson is required to come back to Los Angeles and to actually go into a courtroom where she has to sit down and she has to provide detail after detail as to her version of the events that led to her disappearance. And if people go back and read the testimony, which they should, because it is the young and restless, bold and beautiful, guiding light, days of our lives, as the world turns. It is all of that put into one, because it brings more mystery, more intrigue into this already unbelievable story. And at the end of it, she never admits to rumors that she faked her kidnapping. She never admits that she was having an affair with her radio director, but rather she turns the table and she uses that platform to say, once again, we have a group of people that are trying to discredit me because I'm a female preacher. I've got a successful ministry. And once again, males don't like that. So she tries to change the narrative, which, Ray, we kind of know from following true crime stories that usually when someone tries to change the narrative like that, there's probably some type of guilt in there.
Yeah, and they do a full-fledged investigation. Like you said, she had to go into court before a judge. The police went to the cabin that Kenneth Armiston was staying at, and they dusted for fingerprints. By the way, they did not find McPherson's fingerprints there at the cabin. They do a full-fledged investigation until the Los Angeles District Attorney, Asa Keys, decides, you know what, despite everything, I just don't have enough evidence to get a prosecution here. some of these witnesses that claim to have seen her in Northern California maybe aren't that credible. So he drops the charges. So from a legal standpoint, Chris, this situation with McPherson was never resolved. As a result, even today, all these decades later, the question mark is, Chris, the question is, did she fake her kidnapping or was she really kidnapped? I mean, she was a public figure at the time. It is not hard to believe that people seeking a ransom may have grabbed her. It's not beyond the pale of possibility, but it is also not beyond the pale of a possibility, as you've already hinted at, that she was seeking maybe to get more attention to her ministry and to herself. But I think a third possibility is maybe she just needed a break. Maybe she wanted to get away with this Kenneth Armiston guy or somebody else, or maybe by herself. She just wanted to get away. And this fake kidnapping was the way to do it. But of course, as you mentioned, the police and the authorities are going to have to investigate this because, as you said, Chris, she's claiming she was kidnapped, that there was a ransom. She claims that she was taken across state line into Mexico. And also, I believe you said 2 people died in the search for her. This is a serious matter. So I think, Chris, the question on the table is, was this an actual kidnapping, or was this either a publicity stunt or just an attempt to get away and things maybe got out of hand?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess we'll never know, but the evidence to me just kind of shows a woman who had reached her pinnacle, become very prideful, lost what her main focus was, and just started to spiral out of control. And I think you see that with the anger that she had with the police and with the prosecutors. I mean, she was basically saying, how dare they question my story? Don't they know who I am? I mean, she goes at length to try to destroy the careers of the chief of detectives who researched the case or studied the case, and the deputy district attorney. She, at one time she said, well, they're just both Catholics who are persecuting a Protestant minister, and then when that doesn't work, she goes after the press. And Ray, they used to be her biggest fans. The press is who she used to basically get her message out there. And now she's mad at them because what they're trying to do is trying to prove that her story is false rather than searching for evidence that it's true. And so she basically has this attitude that anyone who has less than absolute faith in her story is basically against her, and she is going to do whatever she has to really make sure that she doesn't lose her fan base. And she'll use these individuals in her sermons. And I remember she said something like, after a rescue, she gathered the flock together, and she said, I am so good at saving souls that I'm just a good big old target for the devil, and he was trying to finish me off, and one of these days I'm going to be a martyr. And that's kind of what she's doing. She's now throwing everything at the devil. She's putting everything at all of these other people and trying to get them to understand that, hey, I'm just getting persecuted because of what I'm doing.
Yeah, I mean, and she goes back out on the road once things sort of settle down. She goes back out on the road. She actually has a break with her daughter. Her and her daughter have some sort of a falling out. She goes back out on the road, and then, just sort of fast forwarding a little bit to World War II, she's involved in selling war bonds. So she gets involved in that. So she once she sort of comes out of this immediate storm, and she goes back on the road, evangelistic meetings, selling war bonds. And Chris, this sort of brings us to the end of her life. When she, in September of 1944, in Oakland, California, she rides in a parade. And she promises on the 26th, I think it is, September 26th, she promises to come back the next day and give a speech telling her life story, which apparently was something that people like to hear. They like to hear her tell her life story. I remember, Chris, when I was in high school, there was a lady who was very popular who would tell a story about some lamb or something, I don't know. And everybody loved to go hear the story from this lady. But apparently it was the same thing with Aimee Semple McPherson. People wanted to hear the story that she had to tell. Unfortunately, Chris, she didn't make it to the next day.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, Ray, I know we're going to talk about, kind of how she dies and the way that she does, but this is a very hard death. Not just for her, but the whole aspect of those that had followed her faithfully and had subscribed to what she was saying. I mean, it was like they themselves had somewhat died too, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you mentioned it was a hard death. One thing that sort of, in our last episode on Aimee Semple McPherson, we talked about the fact that in some ways she was an entertainer and in some ways she was an evangelist. And her death really reminds you more maybe of a movie star death, a Marilyn Monroe type of situation where you have this, this blonde bombshell type of person who, is found dead in a hotel room. And it sort of has that. It's not the kind of death you would expect from someone who's in the ministry. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, but I think it once again kind of maybe proves that maybe it was a fake kidnapping and it was a fake this, because she dies lonely. She dies having lost everything that she once had. And for her to leave this world in that fashion, I think just signifies that you can be at the top of the ladder. You can have everything and still be hollow inside.
Yeah, and she was what had happened. I think the basic outline of what happened. She went back to the hotel room. She was suffering from not being able to sleep, and she takes a number of sleeping pills, relaxants to help her go to sleep, and she accidentally overdosed on sleeping pills. Her son Rolf is the one who finds her the next morning around 10:30. And I'm looking here at the obituary from September 28, 1944 from the LA Times. It says, quote, "She was found in bed by her son Rolf, who said that although unconscious, she was breathing heavily when he entered her room in the Leamington Hotel at 10:30 a.m. Two doctors and an Oakland Fire Department inhaler squad worked in vain to revive her. She was pronounced dead at 11:55 a.m. And they go on to say that they thought initially maybe that it was caused by a heart attack, though, and they say, quote, "The autopsy was ordered after a bottle containing about 20 sleeping capsules was found in her handbag. The bottle was about half full and there were several capsules scattered on the floor beside her bed," end quote. And they do go on to say that she had been having trouble sleeping and had been very excited by the parade the day before and was looking forward to the events of the following day. And maybe she just accidentally took too many in an attempt to get to sleep. But Chris, like I said, when you think about, okay, does this death fit in the category of evangelist, preacher, gospel proclaimer, or does this death fit in the category of entertainer?
Yeah, and I guess if I fast forward a little bit, because as I was thinking about this episode that we were going to do, I kind of went back to something that I remember when I was growing up, and you'll remember when you were growing up too, is let's take away the death aspect right now, but her life is very similar to another evangelist, and who was charismatic and entertaining as well, and that was Jim Bakker. You remember Jim Bakker from, what was it, the 90s, I guess, right? 80s and 90s. Was it PTL, Praise the Lord Ministries?
Yeah.
You remember that?
Aimee Faye, yeah.
Yeah, and Tammy Faye, right? The makeup lady. So, I started thinking about the comparisons between Aimee and Semple McPherson and Jim Bakker. They were both charismatic and they had limited educational and economic opportunities. But yet what they did is they were able to draw emotional support and financial support from a devoted following. I mean, they were shepherds and they had their flocks. And both Aimee and Jim would have these worldwide ministries. They had emotional sermons that were on simple themes. They promoted a gospel of love. I mean, they had dramatic devices. I mean, Aimee, she's dressing up, embracing faith healing. You got Jim and Tammy Faye, who actually create a resort, where people could stay and people could travel and go and look at it. And, they recognized, both of them recognized the power of the media and not just getting the gospel out, but getting their names out. Aimee used radio, Jim uses television, and that they pioneered new ways of soul winning, to the point, Ray, where I think if you look at religion today and you look at quote, church, you still see what Aimee did and what Jim did in some of these church services, and the way that they try to bridge this gap between entertainment and religion. And so I don't know. I just thought that, here's two individuals that have this thriving ministry. However, both of them have dramatic downfalls. And yet their legacy is still being acted out. We're not going to name names, but it doesn't take much to just think about very prominent, nationally known religious movements, some just recently in the news, who are still propagating that same message. Would you say that's accurate?
Absolutely. And when I think about Aimee Semple McPherson and people who followed in her footsteps, a person from the 1970s really comes to my mind, and that's a lady called Catherine Coleman. Really is sort of following in the footsteps of McPherson. And then, like you said, Jim and Tammy Faye Bakker and others today that are definitely in that line of real showmanship, prosperity focus, that kind of thing. We see a lot of that today, and I think some of it at least does go back to Aimee Semple McPherson, and like her, unfortunately.
Yeah, and they appeal to sympathy, and all of a sudden, because of these conspiracies, they try to become victims, right? They try to evoke sympathy from their listeners. They make I remember reading something about Aimee McPherson. I don't remember where it came from, but she would make this big scene of like almost fainting because the pressure that is being faced with her by the police and the prosecutors and the press was just so overwhelming. And, she would have to have physical support to be able to continue speaking. And, she just kept saying that, my health is so fragile because what was one quote that she said? Something like, there is no woman of the streets who has been given less consideration that's been given me. I mean, just this woe is me kind of mentality, breaking into sobs, just saying, I wish people would just see me for who I was. And so I have to ask, did they go into this victim aspect of ministry? And by doing that, did it harm their legacy? Has it harmed their legacy? Because nobody remembers Aimee Semple McPherson that much, but you think about some of the great crusaders, George Whitefield and Billy Graham, Billy Sunday, things of those natures, their legacy is still intact.
Yeah. It's sad because I think I think about Jim Bakker. You had mentioned Jim Bakker. He's still alive and active today, and I think if PTL and that whole scandal didn't hurt his reputation, things he did during the pandemic did hurt it even more. And, when you think about someone like Aimee Semple McPherson and the cloud that surrounds her ministry with the kidnapping, with her death, I think certainly it maybe overshadows the good she did, because I don't want us to walk away from this episode, only focusing on the negative. She did a lot of good, whether we're talking about her preaching, whether we're talking about, feeding people and clothing people during the Great Depression, whether we're talking about her activities in World War II, selling war bonds and stuff. She did a lot of good. But I think a lot of that, like you said, Chris, is overshadowed by the controversy and the defensiveness and things like that, that came following her kidnapping.
Yeah, I agree 100% with you, because she is a fascinating woman to study, because during her ministry, not only did she transform the gospel message, but she actually opens the door for new opportunities to be established within the church. She pushes away the fight for religious superiority, and she is intent on ushering in a new way of loving Christ and sharing Christ's love with others. And she brings about these reform efforts. She has engaging, heartfelt worship services. And so I do think that she completely changed Christianity for the better. One final story that I'll share is comes from her sermon that was called "This and That," which you can find online. It's very interesting. And she was preaching from Mark chapter 16, verse 15, which states, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." And one of the things that she said in that is, she said this. She said, "Get your uniforms on. Oh, let's all shine where we are. This is my task. And by his grace, we'll get the gospel clear around the world." You say, "Sister, it seems to me that you've bitten off a pretty big task there. You and who else can do all of this?" And she said, "God and you and I." And I think, Ray, you summed it up best. There is more good in Aimee than the tragedy that fell her. And so remember that when we think about this individual, Sister Aimee, she did her best to go into all the world, and using what she had been given to let everybody know in her way, in an exciting way, a new way that had modernized and revolutionized and empowered all people to recognize the opportunity they have to invest in faith sharing.
Absolutely. And with that, we will close this episode and our two-part series on Aimee Semple McPherson. We hope our listeners have enjoyed not just simply this episode, but the previous episode on McPherson. If you have any other historical figures you would like us to talk about or to examine certain aspects of their lives, just let us know. You can always contact us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, Stitcher, Spotify, wherever you get your podcast. And we hope you will share this podcast with your family and friends. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And we will talk to you later.